Hi friends, in this tutorial series, we'll be implementing examples using Spring Boot 3 and gRPC. In previous tutorial, we implemented unary gRPC using Spring Boot 3. In this tutorial, we'll be implementing server streaming gRPC using Spring Boot 3. For this, I'll be taking reference of my website javanews.com. So go to Spring Boot 3. In Spring Boot 3, go to Spring Boot 3 gRPC examples. So in previous tutorial, we had implemented Spring Boot 3 gRPC unary example. In this tutorial, we'll be implementing Spring Boot 3 gRPC server streaming example. So in previous tutorial, we had looked at the different types of gRPC calls. Also in another tutorial, we had implemented Spring Boot 3 gRPC unary example. You can go through both these tutorials here. In this tutorial, we'll be implementing Spring Boot gRPC server streaming call. So what is a gRPC server streaming call? Server streaming gRPC, it is a communication protocol that allows server to send a stream of responses to the client. So whenever the server, it needs to send a large amount of data back to the client, then it cannot do so in a single call. So what the server does is that it pushes this large amount of data as a continuous stream of updates back to the client. So server streaming gRPC call, it is used in scenarios like stock market prices updates, weather updates, news feeds, or even sending large files in chunks from the server to the client. For this tutorial, the scenario that we'll be implementing is as follows. So the bank client, he needs all his banking transactions of the last 30 days. So he sends this request to the bank server. Now this transaction data of the last 30 days or maybe last 90 days, it is very large. So the bank server, he cannot send back this response to the client in a single response. So instead the bank server, it sends this response as a stream of data back to the bank client. We'll be implementing this use case using Spring Boot 3. So let us begin with the implementation part. So we'll first be creating this Spring Boot server streaming gRPC server. For this, we'll be creating a Maven project. So go to Eclipse and create a new Maven project. Other, Maven project, next, create a simple project, com.javanews, artifact ID, give it as boot, server streaming, gRPC server. And next in the pom.xml, we'll be adding the required dependencies. The first is the Spring Boot starter parent dependency. This dependency provides default configuration dependencies and plugins that are commonly used in Spring Boot applications. The next is the gRPC server Spring Boot starter dependency. This dependency provides the necessary components to integrate and run a gRPC server within a Spring Boot application. Next, we have the gRPC stub dependency. This dependency, it provides the classes and utilities for creating and using gRPC stubs which are used to make remote procedure calls. The next dependency is gRPC protobuf dependency. This dependency provides support to define and exchange structured data between our gRPC client and server. And finally, we have the annotations API dependency. This dependency provides the necessary annotations for Java code generated by the protobuf Maven plugin. Finally, in the pom.xml, we define the protobuf Maven plugin. Using this plugin, we auto-generate the required gRPC classes using the proto file defined in the source main proto folder. So let us make these changes to the pom.xml. Copy this. Go to Eclipse and here paste this. Next, in the source main proto folder, we'll be creating a proto file named bankservice.proto. So proto file in gRPC, it is a special type of file that helps define the structure and communication between the different software components. So it acts like a blueprint for creating and interacting between these components. In our case, we'll be having the same bankservice.proto file at both the server as well as the client end, and using this proto file, some gRPC classes will be auto-generated and the server and the client will use these classes to communicate with each other. Let us have a look at the proto file that we'll be creating. So first we have a message here named account request. So this is the request that will be sent from the client to the server, and it will be having two fields. The first is the account number. So this is the account number for which we want the transaction details. The next is the duration in days. So this specifies for how many days we want the transaction details for this particular account number. So we'll be sending this account request from the client to the server. So once the server receives this account request, it will fetch multiple transaction details. So these transaction details, they will be the details of the transactions carried out by the client for the duration in days. So it will be having the transaction ID, then the transaction type, whether it was a credit or a debit transaction, and the transaction amount for which the transaction was made. So these transaction details for this particular duration in days will be fetched by the server. So at the gRPC server end, we'll be defining the transaction service, which will be having a method stream transactions. This method, it takes account request as a parameter and it returns back the stream of transaction detail list. So transaction detail list is nothing but a list of the transaction details that we have specified here. So we'll receive the account request fetch all the transaction details and then pass them as a list, and this list it will be returned back as a stream to the client. So let us create this proto file. Go to Eclipse, in source main create a folder, name it as proto. In proto folder create a new file, name it as bank service.proto. Copy the contents of this proto file. Next we'll be creating the Spring Boot Bootstrap class. So this class it will be used to start the Spring Boot gRPC server application, and it has the Spring Boot application annotation. So let us create this class. Create a new class. Package will be com.javanews.bank. Copy the contents of this class. Next, in the pom.xml, we have defined the protobuf maven plugin, which will read the proto file located in the source main proto folder and auto-generate gRPC classes for us. These gRPC classes will be used by the server to stream the data to the client. So let us auto-generate these classes by running this protobuf maven plugin. The pom.xml, go to run as maven build, and we'll be using the command eclipse clean install. So this will create the proper folder structure for the auto-generated classes. So the build is successful, and also if we refresh this project, here we can see that gRPC classes, they are auto-generated in the target folder. Next, in the proto file, we have defined that the transaction detail list will be returned back to the client as a stream. So this transaction detail list, it is nothing but a list of transaction detail which has the transaction ID, transaction type and the transaction amount. So let us create a class name transaction which will be having these details. So here we have the class transaction which has the ID, type and amount. Let us create this class. Go to Eclipse, create a new class. Package will be com.javanews.bank.model. Copy the contents of this class. Next, we create a class name transaction history service with which we make use of the gRPC service annotation, which exposes this class over the gRPC protocol. Also, this transaction history service, it extends the gRPC generated base class transaction service gRPC.transaction service IMPL base. So by extending this generated base class, we get a template with the necessary methods for implementing a logic, and we don't need to deal with the lower level gRPC communication details. The transaction history service, we override the stream transactions method. So this stream transactions method, it is the same method that we have defined here in the proto file. So this method, it takes the account request as a parameter. So this is the request that we receive from the client. We have another parameter here named response observer. Using this response observer, we will be sending back the transaction detail list as a stream back to the client. In the stream transactions method, we make a call to another method named fetch transactions, to which we pass the request.getDuration in days. So this fetch transactions, it should fetch the transaction details based on the duration in days. So it should fetch these transactions from the database, and here we'll then get the list of transactions for that particular client in that duration of days. But for this example, the fetch transactions, it will return back some mock or hard-coded data. So here we have 5 transactions which will be returned back by the fetch transactions method. Next, we initialize a variable named batch size to 3. So it specifies how many transactions should be sent back at once to the client. So currently this value is specified as 3. So in a stream, first 3 transactions will be sent. Then the remaining transactions in the size of 3 will be sent back to the client. So next we iterate over the list of transactions that we have. Then we convert these transactions that we have to transaction details. So we have specified in the proto file that we'll be returning back a list of transaction details. So the transaction, it is converted to transaction detail here in the method create transaction detail from transaction using the builder pattern. So once we get the transaction detail list using the response observer, we return it back to the client. Once transaction detail list of size 3 sent back to the client, we make use of thread.sleep method here so that there is some delay between sending batches. This is just for our understanding. So once the 3 transactions have been sent, we again iterate over the transactions and send the remaining transaction detail list back to the client. So let us create this transaction history service class. Go to Eclipse, create a new class. It will be com.javanews.bank.service. Copy the contents of this class. Finally, in the configuration class application.properties, we specify the gRPC port configuration. That is, we want this gRPC server to run on port 8090. So we specify this gRPC server port property. Go to Eclipse. In source main resources, create a new file. Name it as application.properties. And here paste this configuration. We are done with all the changes for the server streaming gRPC server. Let us test these changes. So go to source main Java and here debug this as a Java application. So we are starting the application in debug mode. Also at the service level, we'll be adding some debug points. We'll be testing this gRPC server using Bloom RPC. For this, we need the location of the proto file. So go to properties and I need this location here. Go to Bloom RPC and here we'll be adding the proto file location. So here we get the client for the stream transactions. So account number, I'll just give us 5, account 5, and here the duration in days, currently it is hard coded, still I'll just give it as 90. So here we have received the request and stream transactions method. If you look at the request, here we have account number as account 5 and duration in days as 90. We'll be in the for loop now. In the for loop here, get the transactions of list 5. So here in list transactions, we have these 5 transactions which we have got. Next, as the batch size is 3, so we'll be creating a transaction detail list of size 3 and we'll be returning back this transaction detail list of size 3 back to the client. Next, we return this list back to the client and then we do a thread.sleep. So if we go to Bloom RPC, here we have received 3 transaction details. Now let us continue. Next, we get the other 2 transactions and return it back to the client. So here we have still received 3. If we now run this, we have received the remaining 2 transactions here. So here we can see that the server, it is streaming back the response back to the client. Next, we'll be creating the Spring Boot server streaming gRPC client. This is the Maven project that we'll be creating. So go to Eclipse and create a new Maven project. Create a simple project. Group ID, give it as com.java in use. And the artifact ID, it will be boot server stream gRPC client. Next, in the client application, we'll be adding the required dependencies. So these dependencies, they are similar to the one that we have added for the server. So copy this and paste it in the client. Next, for the client application, we'll be adding the proto file. So this proto file, it is exactly similar to the one that we added for the server. So create a folder named proto, and to this proto folder, add the proto file that we had for the server. Next, for the gRPC client application, we'll be creating the Spring Boot Bootstrap class. So this class is named as Spring Boot gRPC client example application, and it makes use of the Spring Boot application annotation. This class, it is used to start the Spring Boot client application. So let us create this class. Go to Eclipse source main Java and create this class. Package will be com.java in use from Java. Copy the contents of this class. Next, similar to the server application, in the pom.xml for the client, here we have the protobuf Maven plugin, which will generate the gRPC classes using the proto file specified in the source main proto folder. Let us do this. Run as Maven build eclipse :eclipse clear this code. Skip test, apply, run. So here the build, it is successful. Here if we refresh the client project, here we can see that in the target, the gRPC classes, they are auto-generated. Next, we'll be creating a class named transaction service client. So to the constructor of this transaction client, we pass the host and port on which the gRPC server will be running. Using this host and port configuration, it will create a managed channel. So the managed channel is used by the client to open a communication channel to the server. Also in the transaction service client, we have the transaction service gRPC.transaction service stub, which is an auto-generated class, and we'll be initializing this stub in the constructor by passing it the managed channel. Also the transaction service client, it has a method named stream transactions, to which we pass the account number and duration in days. So this is the information that we want to send to the server to get the transaction details for this particular account number. Next, we create a new account request using the builder pattern, to which we pass the account number and the duration in days. Once the account request has been created, we make an asynchronous call to the stream transactions method that we have implemented at the server end using the async stub. Also, when making this asynchronous call, we pass the account request as well as the stream observer, using which we'll be getting back the response from the server. So once we get the response back from the server, the onNext method will get called. So this will do nothing but just print the transaction detail list that we are getting. Next, if all the transaction details have been fetched from the server, then the onCompleted method will be called and we'll just be printing that the transaction streaming is completed. If during this asynchronous call, when getting back the streaming data, if any exception occurs, then the onError method will get called. So let us create this transaction service client. Go to Eclipse, create a new class. Package will be com.javanews.bank.service. The contents of this class. Next, we create a class named bank service for which we make use of the service annotation. Also, this class, it has a method named getTransactions. In this method, we create an instance of the transaction service client. This is the class that we have created above. So when creating this instance, in the constructor, we pass the details or the configuration on which the gRPC server is running. So here it is running on localhost 8090. So we pass this information in the transaction service client constructor. So once this client instance has been created, we call the stream transactions method of this client, to which we pass the account number and the duration in days. So this will fetch us the transaction details from the gRPC server. Finally, we make use of the countdown latch so that we wait till all the transactions are received. And once these transactions are received, we call the shutdown method of the client, which will close the manage channel that we had created. So let us create this bank service class. Go to Eclipse. In service, create a new class. In bank service. Copy this content. Finally, we'll be modifying the Spring Boot Bootstrap class to call the getTransaction method of the bank service. So on startup, we want to call the getTransactions method of the bank service. For this, we are making these changes. Copy this. Go to the application. Import bank service. So we are done with all the changes. Let us now test the Spring Boot gRPC server client. So let us first start the gRPC server in debug mode. So here the gRPC server, it is started on port 8090. Next, we'll be starting the gRPC client. So here I'll be adding the debug point. Also in getTransactions, I'll be adding the debug point. So onNext method and onComplete method and onError method. To start it in debug mode. So here we have got a debug point here. Next, we'll go inside the bank service getTransactions method. We create a client instance. Next, we call the string transactions method. So here we are inside the stream transactions method. Next, we'll make a asynchronous call to the server. We are now inside the setTransactions method of the gRPC server. This will return a list of size 3 back to the client. So here we have received the transaction detail list and it has 3 transactions which will get printed. So here 3 transactions have been received by the client. So here now the client, it has received the other 2 transaction details. Run this. So finally, as all the transactions have been received by the client, so the onCompleted method gets called. And if we now run this, so here in the console we get all the 5 transactions, and finally transaction streaming completed gets printed. So a Spring Boot gRPC client, it has successfully received streaming data from the gRPC server. Hope you have understood this tutorial. You can download the source code from here. Thank you.